Somewhere in the Egyptian desert, a machine was asked the oldest question in archaeology. Not by a scientist defending a career. Not by a documentary crew chasing a theory. Just a simple prompt, typed into Grok, the AI built by Elon Musk's company XAI. Who really built the Sphinx? And the answer that came back was not the tidy textbook line everyone expected. It was not a wild conspiracy either. It was something stranger than both. An AI that refused to pick a side, and in refusing, exposed just how shaky the settled story actually is. Stay with me because by the end of this you will understand why one of the most famous monuments on Earth is still, genuinely, a live scientific argument, and why the honest answer is more interesting than the dramatic one. Let's start with what you were taught, because it's worth saying clearly before we pull it apart. The standard account holds that the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BC, during Egypt's 4th dynasty, as part of the building program of the pharaoh Khafre. Khafre's pyramid sits just behind it. His causeway lines up with it. A diorite statue of Khafre found nearby shares some features with the Sphinx's face. Put that together and you get the version printed in almost every textbook. Workers quarried the pyramid stone from a ridge of limestone, and rather than let the leftover ridge sit there, they carved it into a reclining lion with the pharaoh's face, a guardian for his tomb complex. This is the mainstream position. It's held by the overwhelming majority of Egyptologists and geologists who've studied the site, and it fits neatly with everything else we know about the 4th dynasty. The tools they had, the labor systems they used, the way the whole plateau was organized as one giant construction project, with quarries, ramps, workers' villages, and administrative records all pointing to the same few decades of intense activity. But there is one man who looked at the same stone and walked away with a very different number in his head. His name is Robert Schoch, and unlike most people who challenge the Sphinx's age, he isn't a fringe author with no credentials to lose. He's a geologist, a Boston University professor, and in the early 1990s he went to Giza specifically to study the weathering on the Sphinx enclosure, the deep trench carved around the monument's body. What he found bothered him. The walls of that enclosure aren't just sandblasted the way you'd expect from thousands of years of desert wind. They're grooved and rolling, cut in a pattern that Schoch argued looks like the signature of prolonged, heavy rainfall running down a vertical stone face over a very long time. And Egypt's climate has been arid, essentially a true desert, for thousands of years. So Schoch asked the obvious follow-up. When was the last period wet enough to carve stone like that? His answer pushed the Sphinx's origin back far earlier than 2500 BC, by his estimate, potentially several thousand years earlier, into a much wetter phase of North African climate, a time before written history, before dynastic Egypt existed in any form we recognize. That claim landed like a bomb in the field, and it has never really stopped being argued about. Geologist Colin Reeder independently studied the erosion and reached a broadly similar conclusion about rainfall weathering, though a more modest one than Schoch's, suggesting the Sphinx could be somewhat older than the traditional date without needing to move it back many thousands of years. On the other side, geologists K. Lal Ghouri and several Egyptologists pushed back hard, arguing the weathering pattern can be explained by salt crystallization, water seeping up from below the limestone, evaporating, and slowly flaking the stone apart from within, a process that doesn't require rainfall at all and can happen even in a dry climate over centuries. Egyptologists like Mark Lehner, who has spent decades mapping the Giza plateau stone by stone, have argued that the archaeological context simply doesn't support an older date. There's no evidence of a civilization at Giza capable of this kind of quarrying and engineering thousands of years before Khafre. No tools, no settlements, no supporting structures from that supposed era anywhere on the plateau. The debate, in other words, is real. It's been running for over 30 years, aired at geological conferences and in peer-reviewed journals, and it has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. That's not conspiracy. That's just how contested geology sometimes works when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous and the stakes for getting it right are high. So imagine, for a moment, actually putting this question to Grok the way people online claim to have done. You feed it the weathering patterns, the enclosure geometry, the climate models for the Eastern Sahara. What comes back isn't a single triumphant number. It's a careful hedge, because that's what the actual underlying research supports. The mainstream Khafre attribution, stated as the position most Egyptologists hold and the one best supported by the surrounding archaeological context. And Schoch's water erosion hypothesis, stated as a real but contested minority position within actual geology, not internet folklore, not something a machine uncovered. What makes that answer interesting isn't that a machine discovered something new hiding in the data. It's that the machine, with no career on the line and no journal to keep happy, will actually walk you through both sides evenly, instead of just repeating the confident version you'd get from a plaque at the gift shop. In an odd way, the most stunning thing about asking an AI this question is how unwilling it is to give you the simple, satisfying answer humans have been arguing about for a century. Now, let's talk about the face, because this is the part that gets people every time. If you stand in front of the Sphinx, something about the proportions does feel slightly off, and you don't need an AI to notice it. Art historians and Egyptologists have commented on it for decades. The head does look small relative to the enormous, sprawling body beneath it. Some researchers have proposed that this is because the head was recarved at some point in antiquity, possibly more than once, reshaping an older or damaged head into its current form. This isn't a fringe idea invented for internet clicks. It's a genuine, if unproven, hypothesis discussed within Egyptology, and it's consistent with something we know for a fact happened to the Sphinx. It was restored and repaired multiple times across ancient history, including work carried out under the New Kingdom pharaoh Thutmose IV, more than 1,000 years after Khafre's reign. The famous Dream Stele, a large granite slab placed between the Sphinx's paws, records that Thutmose IV cleared away sand and restored the monument, because even by around 1400 BC, it was already old, half-buried, and in need of repair. There is also evidence of Roman-era restoration work on the paws and the surrounding pavement, meaning the Sphinx you photograph today isn't a single untouched moment from one dynasty. It's a monument that has been maintained, patched, and reworked across roughly 3,000 years of ancient history before we even get to modern conservation efforts in the 20th century. So the honest, responsible version of the recarved head idea isn't that some vanished Ice Age civilization built a lion's head and it was later shrunk into a pharaoh's face. It's that the Sphinx we see today is very likely the product of multiple rounds of ancient restoration on top of an original 4th dynasty core, which is fascinating on its own, without needing to invent a lost civilization to explain it. A structure that has survived, been buried, been dug out, been repaired, and been reburied across 3 millennia doesn't need embellishment to be remarkable. That is already one of the longest continuously significant monuments on the planet. Then there's the sky. You may have heard the idea that the Sphinx faces the exact point on the horizon where the sun rises on the spring equinox, and that this alignment somehow encodes a hidden date. This part is genuinely well documented. The equinox alignment is real and has been measured precisely by surveyors and astronomers alike. What's far shakier is the leaps some popular authors make from there. The claim that because of the slow 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis, known as precession, you can calculate which zodiac constellation was rising behind the sun on that horizon at any point in the deep past, and that this tells you when the Sphinx was built or what it was watching. This idea was popularized by writer Robert Bauval in the 1990s, connecting the Sphinx and the Giza pyramids to the constellation Leo and to Orion, in a body of work that captured enormous public attention, including best-selling books and television specials. It's a genuinely elegant idea, and it's understandable why it captured people's imaginations so thoroughly. But it's important to say clearly, this is not accepted by mainstream archaeoastronomers or Egyptologists as evidence of anything about who built the Sphinx or when. Precession is real physics, measured and confirmed to extraordinary precision. Zodiac constellations, on the other hand, are cultural boundaries humans invented, with fuzzy, arbitrary edges. There's no single agreed-upon moment when the sky became Leo instead of Cancer, because the constellations themselves are just patterns humans drew onto essentially random star groupings. Using that fuzziness to calculate a precise founding date for a monument is something serious astronomers have specifically pushed back on, because you can make the math say almost anything depending on where you draw the constellation's borders and which stars you count as the beginning or end of an age. So when people online say an AI confirmed the Sphinx dates to the age of Leo around 10,500 BC, What's actually happening is that they've fed it a popular but scientifically disputed framework and gotten back a fluent summary of that framework, not a new, independent discovery pulled from raw data no one had seen before. This is really the core thing worth understanding about what's going on with videos like this across YouTube right now. An AI model like Grok doesn't have secret access to ground-penetrating radar data, weathering surveys, or astronomical archives that human researchers don't already have. It doesn't run its own excavation. It doesn't independently remeasure the stone with laser scanners in the middle of the night. What it does is read and synthesize the same publicly available research, papers, and debates that already exist, including Schacht's hypothesis, including Bauval's, including decades of mainstream Egyptology from Leaner and others, and it can present that mixture persuasively, with confident-sounding numbers, because that's what language models are good at, sounding fluent and authoritative even when hedging. That fluency can easily be mistaken for discovery. A number like 94.7% confidence sounds like hard output from a scientific instrument. In reality, if a chatbot ever states something like that, it's almost always synthesizing existing arguments and estimates in prose, not running a calibrated statistical model against raw laser scan data it was never actually given. Being honest about that distinction matters, because it's the difference between an AI helping you understand a real scientific debate and an AI making a discovery, and only one of those is true. It's also worth pointing out how modern researchers actually do study the Sphinx today, because the real methods are genuinely impressive without any embellishment. Teams have used ground-penetrating radar and seismic refraction surveys to map voids and density changes beneath and around the monument, most of which turn out to be natural fissures or later tomb shafts rather than hidden chambers. Photogrammetry and laser scanning have produced extraordinarily precise three-dimensional models of the body and the enclosure walls, letting geologists measure erosion patterns down to the millimeter and compare them across the entire structure rather than relying on a researcher's eye. Conservation engineers continuously monitor the Sphinx for structural weaknesses because soft limestone under a modern industrial atmosphere, with pollution and rising groundwater from nearby development, faces very real, very current threats that have nothing to do with ancient mysteries and everything to do with 21st century Cairo. That ongoing, unglamorous work of measurement and preservation is what real Sphinx science mostly looks like, and it deserves attention too, even if it doesn't produce viral thumbnails. None of this makes the Sphinx boring, by the way. If anything, it's more interesting once you strip out the fake certainty. You have a monument that is, at minimum, roughly 4,500 years old, built by a civilization that was already capable of extraordinary engineering, massive stone quarrying, precise alignment, organized labor on a scale that still impresses engineers today. You have a genuine, decades-long scientific dispute among credentialed geologists about whether that same monument might carry evidence of a much older, wetter climate written into its stone, a dispute that's never been definitively closed either way, and that continues to be debated in real academic settings. You have real evidence that the monument was damaged, buried, and restored more than once across 3,000 years of ancient history, meaning what you're looking at today is a layered object, not a single moment frozen in time. And you have a genuinely precise equinox alignment sitting right alongside a much more speculative zodiac theory that captures imaginations far more than it satisfies actual astronomers. That's not a story that needs an AI to stun anyone. It's a story that's been quietly stunning for 100 years, argued over by real geologists and real Egyptologists, most of whom never got a viral video out of it. So if you actually go ask Grok or any capable AI who built the Sphinx, don't expect a dramatic reveal. Expect something closer to a patient professor, Kafir, most likely around 2500 BC, based on the strongest archaeological evidence we have, with an honest footnote that a minority of geologists, based on real fieldwork, think the weathering tells a more complicated, older story that mainstream Egyptology hasn't accepted. That's the actual answer. It's less cinematic than the machine uncovered a lost civilization. But it's true, and it respects both the scientists who've spent their careers on this and the audience listening right now who deserve to know the difference between a real open question and a manufactured one. Here's what I'd genuinely like to know from you. Not what do you think the machine was hiding, but which side of the real debate do you find more convincing? the mainstream dating tied to Kafir and the Fourth Dynasty, or Shok's rainfall erosion argument for something older? Tell me in the comments and tell me why, the geology, the archaeology, or just the gut feeling standing in front of that stone gives you. If you want the next video to dig into Thutmose IV's restoration and what the Dream Stele actually records word for word, or into how modern radar surveys of the plateau actually work, let me know below, and subscribe if you want to be here when it drops. The Sphinx has been sitting in that sand for a very long time. The real debate about it isn't going anywhere either, and honestly, that's more interesting than a manufactured mystery ever could be.